The night was hot and heavy in a small Texas border town. Officer Mark Delgado sat in his patrol car, staring at a man sprinting down the dirt road. The man was a wanted fugitive. Mark could hit the siren, call it in, and end it right there. But his hand froze on the switch. In his pocket was a folded bus ticket from years ago, a reminder of a night he never talked about. The fugitive disappeared into the shadows, and Mark made the choice that would shock everyone when the truth finally came out. Mark stayed in the car for a moment after the fugitive vanished. His chest was tight, his palms damp against the wheel. He knew the right move was to chase, to arrest, to follow the rules, but something deeper pulled at him. He thought of the bus ticket in his pocket. He pressed a hand against it, as if to keep the memory from spilling out. That night from his past was still shaping his present, even if no one else in the town understood why. He drove slowly instead of chasing. The next morning, the diner was buzzing. Crime had been creeping closer in recent months, and everyone was on edge. Locals whispered about stolen trucks, missing goods, and people crossing in the night. Mark walked in for coffee, feeling their eyes on him. Some nodded, others stared with suspicion. He had a clean reputation, known as firm but fair, yet he felt the weight of what he hadn't done the night before. The fugitive was still out there, and Mark's silence created a shadow heavier than any criminal report could. Later at the station, the police chief gathered everyone. He slammed a folder on the table, warning the officers not to show mercy. The fugitive was dangerous, connected to violence across the border. Mark sat in the back, his face unreadable. He nodded with the others, but inside, his stomach turned. He thought about how quickly he could have ended it. One siren, one radio call, and it would have been over. Instead, he had let the man slip through. The chief's eyes swept the room, lingering briefly on him. That night, Mark sat in his truck, parked on a quiet road. He pulled out his wallet and unfolded the bus ticket, the corners worn and soft from years of being carried. It was dated 1999. He remembered everything about that night, even the sound of the rain on the bus roof. He folded it again, slid it back into his wallet, and leaned his head against the steering wheel. His life had changed because of that ticket, and because of someone else on that bus who had once mattered. Mark's father had also been a cop in the same town, and people never let him forget it. His father had been strict, respected, and hard on him. When his father died, Mark carried not only the badge, but also the weight of the man's reputation. Every mistake, every hesitation, was a mark against the Delgado name. That was why the bus ticket felt like a secret betrayal. It reminded him that his loyalty had once gone somewhere his father would never have approved. He closed his eyes and breathed. He drove the empty streets, lights from old warehouses flickering. The town felt hollow at night, like a place left behind. Mark's radio hummed with routine calls. Nothing urgent, yet his mind was not on his patrol. His thoughts kept circling back to the fugitive's face. Something about the way the man had glanced back before disappearing. It wasn't the look of a predator, it was something else. A flash of recognition, a memory stirring at the edges of his mind. He gripped the wheel tighter, fighting the thought down. The fugitive's name appeared on a missing persons report, tied to violence across the border. Mark sat at his desk, staring at the papers. He should have felt anger or duty, but instead he felt trapped in doubt. Was the man guilty, or was he being hunted for something else? His gut told him one thing. The chief demanded another. He folded the papers and put them away. In silence, he wondered if his father's strict code had been wrong. Maybe mercy wasn't weakness. Maybe it was strength in disguise. The fugitive's face haunted him, following him into sleep. He dreamed of shadows moving through alleys, always just out of reach. In the dream he lifted his radio, but never spoke into it. When he woke, Sweat soaked his shirt, and the memory of the bus ticket returned. That single night so long ago was tied to this moment, and he couldn't shake the sense that everything was repeating. He poured cold water over his head, staring into the mirror. His reflection looked more like his father every day. The next evening, Mark's partner rode along. The partner joked about the fugitive, swore they'd catch him soon, bragged about how he'd handle it. Mark nodded, but stayed quiet. When the patrol car slowed by the warehouses, Mark felt his chest tighten again. His partner didn't notice. He thought about confessing the truth, that he had already seen the fugitive and let him go, but the words stuck in his throat. He said nothing. He turned the wheel, driving them away from the very place where his silence had begun. Whispers started spreading in town. People claimed they had seen the fugitive near the old train yard. Kids joked about it. Adults grew tense, double-checking their locks at night. And in those whispers, Mark's name came up. Some said he had been seen in the area too. His reputation, once untouchable, was starting to fray. He lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling fan spinning overhead. The bus ticket sat on his nightstand now, as if daring him to face the truth. He reached for it, then stopped. Rumors of the fugitive hiding nearby grew stronger. Farmers on the edge of town reported broken fences and stolen food. Mark drove those dirt roads, but avoided the darker paths where he knew the man might be hiding. His contradiction grew clearer. He wanted control, but he couldn't bring himself to enforce it against someone tied to his past. He drove slower each night, scanning fields, headlights sweeping across barns and brush. Every time he spotted movement, he wondered if it was the fugitive waiting for him again. Mark was known as observant, the kind of officer who noticed what others missed. But lately, his mind twisted what he saw. A shadow became a face. A sound became a warning. He misread his surroundings more often than not, and the doubt showed in his eyes. His partner started asking if he was all right. Mark forced a smile, but his nerves were frayed. He couldn't tell the difference between instinct and fear anymore, and every time the radio crackled, he half expected it to call out his secret. One night, a broken streetlight flickered outside his house. The bulb buzzed and sparked, throwing light across his living room window. Mark sat on the couch in the dark, watching it blink. He thought about the fugitive out there, probably watching the same lights from another angle. A wave of unease washed over him. He kept replaying the man's glance, the silent recognition. He rubbed his face and whispered under his breath, though no one could hear him. Why did it feel like this was all connected to him? The next morning, the police chief stood at his desk, reminding him about his father's legacy. The words cut deeper than intended. Mark nodded, hiding the sting. He couldn't forget the funeral, the folded flag, the weight of expectation pressed on his shoulders. His father had died serving the law without bending once. Mark, on the other hand, had bent and maybe even broken it. But deep down, he felt he hadn't been wrong. Still, he couldn't explain why. Not yet. He carried the burden alone, without an answer. The bus ticket remained his secret anchor. Each time he pulled it from his wallet, the smell of the old bus came back, the roar of rain on metal, the feeling of being trapped. He remembered being young, scared, and not knowing what his future would look like. That night had tied him to someone else, and that tie now pulled at him harder than duty ever could. He placed the ticket flat on his table, staring at it as though it held every decision he had ever made. Then the town went dark. A sudden power outage swept across the streets, plunging homes and shops into silence. Mark grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside. The air was heavy, quiet, except for the sound of a dog barking in the distance. His neighbors lit candles in their windows. Mark felt unease crawl up his spine. Blackouts had always made him uneasy. a reminder that order was fragile. As he stood there, he thought he heard the sound of a distant bell, faint and unsettling, carried by the night air. Mark drove through the blackout, headlights cutting through the dark. Buildings loomed, empty and silent. His radio was quiet, his thoughts louder than ever. He gripped the wheel and scanned the alleys. The sound of the bell wouldn't leave his head. It felt like a reminder, though he couldn't explain of what. He thought about the fugitive again, wondering if the man was moving through the dark at that very moment. His chest grew tight, as if each breath carried the weight of a choice he had failed to make. His partner started asking questions. Why was Mark avoiding certain roads? Why did he seem distracted? Mark brushed it off, said he was tired, but the suspicion grew. Each ride along felt more dangerous, not from criminals but from the truth pressing against his chest. If anyone found out he had seen the fugitive and let him go, his career would collapse. Worse, his father's name would be dragged through the mud. The thought made his hands shake. He told himself to stay calm, to keep moving forward. One night, Mark sat at his kitchen table with a cold meal untouched. He stared at it until the food lost its warmth, lost its shape. It was a quiet moment, but it carried weight. He picked at the edges of the bus ticket with his thumb, trying to steady his nerves. He wanted to eat, but his stomach wouldn't let him. The house was silent, too silent. He could hear the hum of the fridge, the creak of wood, his own shallow breaths. He felt utterly, painfully alone. The town grew restless. Posters of the fugitive appeared on walls, light poles, and shop windows. The man's face stared back at everyone, including Mark. He felt trapped by the paper image, as though the town itself was accusing him. He ripped one down in secret and folded it into his jacket pocket. At home, he laid it beside the bus ticket. The two pieces of paper seemed tied together, past and present, staring back at him. He sat there in the dim light, torn between duty and memory. At his desk in the station, he noticed a small stack of postcards he had never mailed. They were meant for old friends, people he had lost touch with, words he had written but never sent. He picked one up, reading his own handwriting, then set it down again. He wondered how much of his life had been left unsaid, undone. He thought about the fugitive, about words exchanged long ago that still bound them. He pushed the postcards aside, uneasy at the reflection they offered of his silent choices. News came that the fugitive had been spotted near the train yard. Officers rushed, lights flashing, radios buzzing. Mark drove too, but he slowed when the old train cars came into view. He could see shadows moving, but his headlights stayed dim. The fugitive could have been there, close enough to catch. Instead, Mark turned down another road, circling the area but never closing in. His chest burned with the weight of it. He told himself it was for a reason, yet deep down he feared the truth. Back at the station, whispers followed him. A few officers glanced at him, longer than they should. Others dropped their voices when he walked by. The gossip in town had leaked into the station. People said he was protecting someone, that maybe he had ties he didn't want revealed. Mark kept his face calm, but the rumors cut deep. His father's name echoed in his head again, as if accusing him too. He gripped the bus ticket in his pocket, the edges digging into his fingers like punishment. Mark knew the fugitive was out there, waiting. The town kept stirring with fear, and each night felt heavier. He drove alone, windows down, air thick with dust and the smell of heat. Every shadow felt like a reminder. The bus ticket shifted in his pocket, the paper soft but unrelenting. He thought about burning it, erasing it from his life, but he couldn't. It was the only proof of that night, the only tie left to a truth he hadn't shared. He pressed harder on the gas, restless. When dawn broke, Mark stood outside his house, watching the sun rise over the flat land. The town was waking, the people stirring, unaware of the battle inside him. His silence had become a second skin. He had let the fugitive go, and now suspicion was spreading. The bus ticket felt heavier than ever, though it weighed nothing. He held it in his hand and stared at it, wondering how much longer he could carry the secret. The truth was coming closer, and he knew it would not stay hidden. A neighbor swore he saw Mark driving near the train yard, the same night the fugitive was spotted. The rumor reached the station quickly, and soon the chief called Mark into his office. The chief's tone was sharp, his eyes cold. He asked why Mark's patrol logs didn't line up. Mark answered carefully, sticking to routine excuses, but sweat ran down his back under the uniform. He felt the walls closing in. The chief stared too long before dismissing him, and Mark knew suspicion had turned into something stronger. Mark walked out of the station, his boots heavy against the tile floor. His badge felt like a weight pulling him down. He had always seen himself as a protector, someone who kept order when others couldn't. Now doubt was everywhere, inside him, around him, in every whisper. He climbed into his truck and gripped the wheel until his knuckles turned white. His thoughts went back to the bus ticket, back to that night in 1999. He told himself that if people knew what really happened, they'd understand, but could they? At dusk, he stood in a parking lot, watching a drone buzz overhead. The machine flickered, lost control, and spiraled down into the dirt. Mark bent to pick it up. The plastic cracked and useless. He turned it in his hands, thinking about how even something built to watch and capture could fail. It felt like a warning. His role as an officer was crumbling the same way, slipping beyond repair. He set the drone on the hood of his truck and leaned there, staring at the horizon, unsettled. Rain returned that night, the first in weeks. Mark sat on his porch, listening to it, hit the roof and wash the dust from the street. It was one of those quiet moments where time slowed. He thought about the fugitive, imagined him listening to the same rain from somewhere nearby. Mark closed his eyes, the sound pulling him back to that bus ride in 1999. He was a teenager then, scared and alone, staring out the window as rain blurred everything outside. That memory carried a hidden weight. On that bus, years ago, Mark had seen the man who now ran as a fugitive. Back then, the man was older, stronger, but trapped in his own way. When a fight broke out, Mark had been cornered, a blade pressed too close. It was that man who pulled him free, who stood between him and danger, who saved him without asking for thanks. Mark never forgot the eyes, the calm, the quiet protection. That was why the ticket still stayed in his wallet. It was proof of survival. Mark sat at his kitchen table, the bus ticket laid out beside the police report. Two truths sat side by side, one from the past, one from the present. He pressed his palm over both, wondering which weighed more. If the town knew, would they see mercy or betrayal? His father would have called it weakness. His chief would call it treason. But to Mark, it felt like a debt. He couldn't bring himself to turn in the man who had once stood for him. The choice haunted him. The whispers grew into questions. Why was the fugitive always one step ahead? Why hadn't Mark ever been the one to spot him? His partner began watching him more closely. Mark caught the looks, sharp and probing, but said nothing. One night, he found himself parked at the edge of the desert, far from town, staring at the horizon. He thought about leaving, about driving, until the land swallowed him. But he stayed. He knew running wouldn't erase the truth. The past was locked in him, unspoken but unrelenting. The truth finally pushed through. The fugitive wasn't guilty of everything he was accused of. Documents showed he had taken blame for someone else, protecting someone higher up. Mark sat with the files late at night, hands trembling. If this came out, it would tear the department apart. He realized the man he let go wasn't running from justice, but from a system that wanted him silent. The discovery lit a fire in Mark's chest. He wasn't sure if it was anger, fear, or relief. Maybe it was all three. The real shock came when Mark uncovered the name tied to the crimes, the name of a man inside the department. His mentor, the officer who had trained him, the man everyone trusted. It explained everything: the urgency to catch the fugitive, the silence in certain files, the warnings to show no mercy. It had all been cover for corruption. Mark leaned back, heart pounding, realizing the ally he had trusted was the true antagonist all along. The betrayal cut deep, sharper than anything he had faced before. Now Mark faced a choice: protect the department's name, or expose the truth and lose everything. His badge, his family's reputation, his entire life's work, all of it balanced on the edge of one decision. He thought again of the bus ticket, of the man who had once protected him, without asking for anything in return. Maybe this was the moment to return that act. His father's code felt far away now. Mark looked at the papers again, jaw tight, knowing what he had to do. If you've been wondering how Mark's secret could possibly end, you're not alone. Consider subscribing to see the truth revealed. Mark gathered the files and brought them home, hiding them beneath floorboards. He didn't trust the station, didn't trust his partner, didn't even trust the chief. He felt eyes on him everywhere. Each step outside carried the risk of being followed. He thought about the fugitive again, about how the man had lived in hiding all these years. Now Mark understood it. The paranoia, the weight, the fear. He lit a single lamp and sat in the dim glow, staring at the documents that could destroy everything. The next morning, the town was buzzing with news of another sighting. But Mark's mind was elsewhere. He studied the names in the files, tracing the connections. Money shifted hands, cases had been buried, and people had been sacrificed to keep reputations intact. The fugitive had been the shield. Mark clenched his fists, realizing the scale of it. His stomach turned as he thought about the people who had trusted the department for protection. His badge on his chest felt heavier than ever, not a symbol of pride anymore. Late at night, Mark drove past the edge of town and found himself face to face with the fugitive again. The man didn't run this time. He stood still, calm, like he had been waiting. They stared at each other in the headlights' glare. Mark's hands shook on the wheel. He thought about reaching for the radio, but he didn't. The man nodded once, almost as if to say, "You know the truth now." Then he turned and walked into the desert. Mark let him go, choosing silence again. The next day, Mark discovered a note tucked beneath his windshield wiper. No signature, just a sentence. "The truth is heavier than chains." He read it 3 times, then folded it into his pocket beside the bus ticket. The 2 pieces of paper felt linked, past and present pressing together. He realized the fugitive wasn't asking for freedom anymore. He was asking for the truth to come out. Mark leaned against his truck, staring at the horizon, and knew he couldn't carry the silence much longer. When Mark finally confronted his mentor, the conversation was cold. The older man's smile was thin, his words sharper than knives. He warned Mark not to dig deeper, not to throw away his career over old ghosts. Mark's pulse pounded. For years, he had looked up to this man, had shaped his choices around his teachings. Now he saw the rot beneath the surface. He left the office in silence, but his decision was already forming. The truth would come out, no matter the cost. He couldn't hide anymore. The chief noticed Mark's distance, his silence, and pressed harder. Mark avoided direct questions, gave short answers, but his nerves betrayed him. He walked through the station like a ghost, hearing laughter and chatter, but feeling completely cut off. Each locker slam echoed too loud. Each phone ring felt sharp. The building no longer felt like a place of order. It felt like a trap. He stopped by his father's old locker, untouched for years, and rested his hand against it. The contrast between legacy and reality was unbearable. Mark sat alone in his living room, holding the bus ticket in one hand and the files in the other. Two pieces of paper, two lives tied together. One represented his past, a night when he was saved. The other represented his present, a system poisoned from within. He realized the only way to honor both was to speak out, but it meant losing his badge, his shield, his identity. He closed his eyes, breathing deeply, and accepted that sacrifice might be the only way forward. The fugitive's family was found hiding near the border, desperate and afraid. Mark drove out there quietly. No backup, no radio. He saw the children's faces, tired and scared, and the woman who clutched them close. This wasn't the picture of ruthless criminals the posters had painted. This was a family broken by lies. Mark stood there in silence, guilt washing over him. He thought of his own childhood, of the weight his father had carried, and he knew what he had to do. He couldn't let the cycle continue. That night, Mark walked into the chief's office and placed the files on the desk. He spoke plainly, no excuses, no hesitation. He told the truth, every detail, every name. The chief's face hardened as he realized what was being exposed. Mark didn't wait for threats or promises. He laid down his badge beside the files and walked out. The station's halls were quiet, but in his mind, the sound of that distant bell returned. It no longer felt like a warning. It felt like the start of something else. The fallout was immediate. News spread, the department fractured, and the mentor who had once shaped Mark's career was exposed as corrupt. Some officers turned away from Mark, calling him a traitor. Others thanked him quietly. The fugitive's name was cleared in whispers, though he was never found again. Mark's world shifted overnight. He had no badge, no shield, no title, but he had the truth. And for the first time, he felt like he was carrying something real, instead of a weight that wasn't his. The town struggled to absorb what had come out. Some citizens were furious at the department, others shaken by the betrayal. Mark walked the streets without a uniform, just another man among them. Eyes followed him, some filled with anger, others with respect. He kept his head down but didn't hide. For years he had represented the law. Now he was just Mark, carrying the scars of choices made and truths revealed. He felt lighter in some ways, heavier in others. It was a strange kind of freedom. At home, Mark placed the bus ticket on the table and smoothed it flat. He stared at the faded ink, the date, the creases. It had survived years of being carried, folded, unfolded, hidden. It was proof of a night that had shaped his path. He realized he didn't need to carry it anymore. He placed it in a small box, closed the lid, and set it on a shelf. Not erased, not forgotten, but finally put to rest. For the first time, he let his hands be empty. He walked through town the next morning, passing the diner where people still whispered. A few nodded at him. Others turned away. The world didn't change overnight, but something inside him had. He didn't need their approval anymore. He had faced the truth, faced his own contradiction, and chosen a path. He sat down at the counter, ordered coffee, and drank it slowly. The ordinary moment felt different now, steadier, like he was finally living as himself instead of his father's son or the department's officer. The train yard grew quiet again. The fugitive was never caught, never seen in town again, but people said his shadow lingered, that he had passed through and left something behind. Mark believed it too. Every time he drove by the tracks, he thought about that last nod, that silent understanding. He wondered if the man had found peace or was still running. Either way, the truth had been freed, and maybe that was all that mattered. The bus ticket, the files, the silence, they had all served their purpose. Mark walked the streets at dusk, the sun setting low over the desert. He felt the air cool on his face, the smell of dust and rain mixing in the wind. The town was still the same, yet completely changed. His badge was gone, his title gone, but his burden had lifted. He had let a fugitive go, and the truth had stunned everyone. Now he lived with the aftermath, bittersweet but real. He took a deep breath, stepped forward, and carried himself into the night, unshackled at last.